For this Autism Awareness Day, Apidauta brings you Monotropism, our favourite explanation of autism. What is this theory? Who invented it? And why haven't I heard of it before? To find out, let's start by looking up its creators. Here is its number one mummy, Dinah Murray, who was a psycholinguist by training, but liked to refer to herself as a productive irritant because of her enthusiastic dedication to activism. In the 1980s, when she'd just completed her PhD and was preparing it for publication as a book, her colleague at UCL, Robin Carston, lent her a copy of Uta Frith's book, Autism, Explaining the Enigma. Dinah read it, became hooked on the topic, and abandoned the preparation of what was never to become her first book. As she liked to say, she did not find the answer to the enigma of autism in Uta Frith's book, but she did find a feeling that she might be able to uncover it herself. So she dedicated the 1990s to thinking about autism. She became a support worker and befriended many autistic people, their families, and autism professionals, gradually getting to know her own autistic brain in the process. And what of her answer to the enigma of autism? There's a clue in the title of her 1992 paper, Attention Tunnelling and Autism. Monotropism's other mother was Wendy Lawson, a psychologist who was formally diagnosed autistic in 1994. But no, we need to correct this. Since 2014, when Wendy became Wen Lawson, monotropism has had a mum and a dad, not two mummies. Towards the end of the 1990s, at a conference where Wendy was presenting on life and learning in autism, single-focused attention, the two met, and there began a long and fruitful friendship and intellectual collaboration. At this point, we should add to our story the also autistic mathematician, philosopher, and activist Mike Lesser, whom we could call Monotropism's uncle. Together, in 2005, Dinah, Wendy, and Mike published the seminal article of monotropism theory, Attention, Monotropism, and the Diagnostic Criteria for Autism. Here is its logo, because monotropism is gathering momentum, and as well as a theory, is becoming something of a movement, and a movement needs a good logo. This movement is gaining an especially enthusiastic following among the neurodivergent communities that meet and flourish, support and empower each other on the internet. Why do digital autists tend to like this theory so much? Maybe it's because it's the first theory of autism to be proposed by consciously autistic people. Maybe because it's the first one to propose a difference model rather than a deficit model explanation of autism. Maybe it's just because we tend to get a bit obsessed with topics that pique our curiosity, and the topic of autism has a habit of doing that, and we just love having the chance to explore a new autism theory. Or maybe it's because we love a beautiful, simple, yet unifying theory that confers order and meaning on such apparently complex realities. Or because it just resonates so powerfully, helping us to make sense of so much lived experience. Most probably, it's for each and every one of these reasons. Okay, I think I've made it clear that monotropism theory tends to be much appreciated by the autistic people who have the good fortune to cross paths with it. The time has come to explain exactly what this theory says and how it claims to explain all of autism. Monotropism proposes that human brains basically come in one of two categories: polytropic ones, which are the majority, and monotropic ones, which belong primarily to autistic humans. It also says that the sum total of attention that is available to all human brains is limited and more or less constant. The difference between these two types of brain lies not in the amount of attention they can command, but in the way that attention is distributed. As its name indicates, the polytropic brain tends to distribute its attention in many thematic directions, tropos. It can dedicate some attention here, to watching a video about monotropism on YouTube, for example. but is at the same time aware of its surroundings. It's human, wants to get off the bus at the right stop. He's also listening with half an ear to what the two ladies behind him are saying, is attentive to the people getting onto the bus, so if somebody who needs a seat more than himself gets on, he can offer it, notices that he's starting to get hot and takes his scarf off, and while all of this is going on, he receives, reads, and replies to some messages on his phone. His polytropic brain not only can function in this way, it's truly comfortable doing so. This is really quite difficult for those of us who don't have this sort of brain to comprehend. And apart from being able to distribute attention like this brain is also agile. It can open new attention channels, close others, turn up the attention volume over here, turn it down there, without feeling any pain. It's a born multitasker. Here, on the other hand, we have a only one, tropic theme brain. It's human, is also watching a video about monotropism on the bus. She finds the topic fascinating, and it has captured her attention. Literally, all of her attention. Her brain is positively vibrating with the pleasure of allowing itself to be dragged into this attention tunnel. When she finishes the video, she looks up more information about monotropism, about Dinah Murray, Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser. She reads their seminal article and completes the online monotropism questionnaire. She becomes a veritable expert on the theory, and her brain has enjoyed the ride so much that all the discomfort and worries that it was carrying before she pressed play on the video have vanished without a trace. But with all of her attention dedicated to just one channel, all of the other channels were switched off. She missed her stop and was thrown off the bus when it reached its terminus 1 hour later. She missed the information about the public transport strike that the two ladies seated behind her had been discussing. She has been the unconscious recipient of the death stares of two old men and a pregnant woman who would very much have appreciated her seat on the bus. Her scarf, which is still firmly round her neck, is soaked in sweat, and her mum, yet again, is anxiously fuming at the lack of response to her urgent and insistent messages. There's the difference between these two models of brain. While polytropic brains are happy dividing their attention among many different and parallel channels, switching unproblematically between them, monotropic brains much prefer to dedicate all their attention to one, or at least very few and related, deep tunnels. Could this difference provide the answer to the enigma of autism? That's exactly what Dinah, Wen, and Mike proposed. To explain why, we're going to see how convincingly the diagnostic criteria for autism, as laid out in the latest edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, can be explained through a monotropic lens. And here is our obvious starting point in section B of the restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities, where we find the highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity and focus, and which are no more and no less than our notorious hyperfocus and special interests. This autistic characteristic isn't just easily explained by monotropism. It is monotropism. From the topical autistic boy busy lining up his toy cars, through the autistic girl lost in her book, to the autistic adult totally immersed in her special interest. This characteristic is one of the autism spectrum's most readily recognizable. The subject of our interest can be pretty much anything, from the typical fixations of the male autistic child of the popular imagination, modes of transport, superheroes, video games, or Japanese manga, for example, to other less typically expected ones, maybe horses, medicinal plants, ancient Egypt, or to stray into territories often loved by autistic people, music, psychology, or that very, very special interest, autism itself. The subject doesn't matter. What does is the intensity with which we focus on it, or in other words, the existence in our brains of attention tunnels. And the deep learning that results from this hyperfocus is what gives us the little professors that Hans Asperger described in 1944, and what paves the way to a PhD for a much more than representative proportion of autistic people. Let's try out another characteristic from section B, the insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or non-verbal behavior. It seems we have trouble with transitions. This characteristic is explained by the inflexibility of the monotropic brain. If I have comfortably and profoundly committed the lion's share of my attention to one singular attention tunnel, any change in attentional direction is going to cost me dear. First, I need to recall all of my deeply committed attention from the tunnel it was currently loving in order to then change its direction of focus and launch it in this new direction. Maybe you can recognize the mental strain and pain this causes in the following examples. The monotropic teacher is interrupted mid-lecture by a message from his deputy head that requires an immediate answer. Okay, this is hurting him inside, but he's an adult and a professional and is holding it together. You probably won't realise quite how hard this is for him, but chances are it will contribute to the shutdown or meltdown that will engulf him once he gets home at the end of the day. The monotropic teenager is told to stop playing his video game and come down to dinner at once. This mental scream is certainly not likely to be contained. His family are going to know exactly how utterly impossible this is for him. The monotropic girl is told that it's time to stop reading and go out to the playground for break time. She may put off the mental pain of this transition by simply ignoring the instruction, but this strategy will most probably come back to bite her. I have yet to meet the teacher who happily tolerates being ignored. And our monotropic boy is told his turn is over and he has to share the toy cars. In his case, the resulting mental anguish might just be so terrible that he never wants to set foot in that bad nursery again. And somebody dares to call the monotropic adult in full creative flow on the phone. Well, no. The truth is, there is no pain here. Her phone is safely switched to silent mode. And how can we minimize the pain of transitions that can't be avoided? With a whole lot of tact, plenty of calm mental preparation, and with a good old routine. For example, the teacher finds his rigid school timetable helpful, but too many unexpected demands on his attention might have him looking for a career change. For the teenager, it's going to be important to learn how to join in with family dinner time. But I'm afraid that aiming for a totally painless transition in his case is overly optimistic. But his family might be able to lessen the trauma somewhat with clear and consistent rules about how long he can play, plenty of calm reminders that time is almost up, and as much sameness as possible in the family dinner that he's called to. what is to be eaten, who will be eating it, where, with what plates and cutlery, etc. We might allow the girl to finish her page or her chapter, and then help her to transition to the playground with small, ritualized steps. You get the point. We monotropic people adhere so inflexibly to our routines, not because of OCD, or because we want to be a pain or attract attention. No. For us, they're a life jacket in a world full of polytropic demands on our attention that we experience as full-on mental aggression. Next, we'll look at the DSM-5's hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input. This is easily understood from a monotropic perspective if we think that each sensory stimulus that we receive is demanding a new mental channel through which it can be processed and then integrated into a holistic perception of our sensory environment. For polytropic people, this can be a harmonious experience, and varied and complex sensory information can be processed and integrated with a sense of balance and well-being. But for the monotropic brain, the opening of each new sensory channel is deeply uncomfortable. For example, the channels demanded by the radio that our monotropists' office mates like to listen to, the conversation that two of them are having at the next desk, a flickering light bulb, and the label that she very stupidly forgot to remove from her new jumper. The discomfort is cumulative, and sometimes, when sensory demands are insistent, strong, and/or simply too many, this is interpreted by the nervous system and its close ally, the immune system, as a full-blown attack, and it is then that our monotropic person becomes hypersensitive, intolerant, dysregulated, allergic even. And what can monotropic people do to protect themselves? They can reduce the sensory challenges that they are exposed to, either in a positive sense, with tools that help them to block or filter unwanted stimuli, seeking out friendly sensory environments, or at least more easily controllable ones, or choosing carefully which stimuli they allow their brains to come into contact with, or in a negative sense, by avoiding, sometimes at all costs, environments that are just too challenging. And hyporeactivity? That's simply the opposite extreme to hyperreactivity, an atypically small or even absent response to sensory stimuli, and it's just as characteristic in autism as the atypically large reactions of hypersensitivity. As seen from the perspective of monotropism, our hyporeactivity simply responds to the happy situation in which we've effectively succeeded in shutting down all alternative attention channels to dedicate ourselves to our one or few preferred tunnels. In this state, our pain threshold can become unbelievably high. We can prompt our worried parents to rush us to get our actually perfectly functional hearing checked. We can display broken thermostat syndrome and wander the frozen streets in a t-shirt in the depths of winter. Or we can totally shut out any bodily signals about growing hunger, thirst, or the need to pee until these have reached true emergency level, or even beyond that level if we're young enough. To finish our examination of Section B, let's look at its stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. Stimming in plainer English. We've seen just how stressful it can be for a monotropic person to accommodate and adapt to the attentional demands of a world designed for and by polytropic people. It's understandable that, existing in such a world, monotropic people have a great need of self-regulating strategies, especially in situations in which our absolutely favourite self-regulating strategy, the escape into a monotropic attention vortex, is not available to us. It's not at all strange that in these situations we turn to calming sensory experiences that are repetitive, familiar, direct, primordial, and essential. the same ones that soothe all dysregulated humans, monotropic or otherwise, from the cradle, literally, to the grave. For autistic stims are simply human stims, the only difference really being that we tend to use more of them, more often, and in situations in which polytropic people don't consider it justified. But stimming is not just a stress management strategy for monotropic people. It's also a way to facilitate and strengthen a deep attention tunnel in flow through the use of amplifying sensory stimuli, like a mantra in yoga, for example. This explains why so many autistic people, when asked about their stims, speak of them fondly and associate them with feelings of peace, harmony, and pleasure. And finally, we've arrived at Section A of the DSM-5, with its persistent deficits in social communication and interaction. These we will take on all together in one great big deficit fest. The root of all these supposed deficits lies in communication with other human beings. And in order to understand the problem monotropic people have with this type of communication, we must pause for a minute to think about all of the multitude of processing channels that are needed for effective reciprocal communication between humans. This communication tends to be spoken. This polytropic brain here is processing sounds to decode words, volume and tone to understand emotions and intentions, and may also be using a visual processing channel to decipher some metaphor or idiomatic expression. But spoken communication is not limited to the speaking of words. This brain is also receiving information via eye contact, body language, the distance between its human and the one it's talking to, physical contact between them even, and all of this back and forth in tiny snippets of conversation. Then we can turn this into an even more typically polytropic social scene by adding more people to the conversation. These polytropic people are loving it. And here, at the edge of the group, observing, wanting to join in and be accepted, but feeling quite overwhelmed, is a monotropic brain. Polytropic communication really isn't his thing. He needs more time to process all this information and often simply lacks the capacity to catch it all. He is deeply uncomfortable, and when he does make the effort to participate socially, also stressed and exhausted. Of course he's going to have trouble relating to other people in a polytropic world, and of course he's going to seek out refuges where he can exist in greater peace and well-being. These refuges might be the silence of temporary or permanent mutism, the peace of social and emotional self-sufficiency. This most often turns to simple loneliness in the long run, though. Intense individual friendships in which communication only ever happens with one other person at a time, and which are based on a shared common interest rather than social contact for social contact's sake. Shield relationships, in which a strong bond is formed with a polytropic person who becomes the guide and shield for the monotropic person. Relationships with other people who find polytropic socializing difficult. A monotropic person will often employ a combination of refuge strategies and integration strategies, and can make gigantic efforts to learn to communicate with and relate to polytropic people. This is what's called masking. But no matter how much he learns, camouflages, and compensates, his brain will not stop being monotropic, and therefore hurt and exhausted by this forced polytropic functioning that is totally contrary to his nature. The price for all this masking will be paid in the currency of his mental health. Finally, let's turn to what the DSM-5 identifies as our deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. In order to maintain healthy relationships with other people, it helps to have common rather than conflicting interests, to share likes and dislikes, a sense of humour, cultural references, and gain a mutual and sustained socio-emotional benefit from the relationship. But sometimes one or more of these pillars wobbles or falls, and in this case, The total collapse of the relationship can be avoided with a liberal dose of empathy, that superglue of human bonds. Empathy comes in two distinct flavours, and we need to distinguish between them clearly. One is emotional empathy. I understand what you're feeling and can feel it too. And the other is intellectual empathy. I understand what you're thinking and why you're thinking it. The one monotropic people have trouble with isn't the first one. In fact, we tend to be hyper-empathic or extra-sensitive in an emotional sense. But with all the challenges we face when communicating in a polytropic world, we find it near impossible to comprehend the mental processes of other people, especially when these are not communicated in the most direct, clear, and honest possible way. We have what's called poor theory of mind, and this is what makes it so difficult for us to understand and maintain relationships. Having said that, we might also recognise that the majority of monotropic people dedicate a massive amount of energy throughout our lives to improving our theory of polytropic mind, as we desperately try to figure out why polytropic people do what they do, say what they say and how they say it, want what they want, and react how they react. Often this becomes a special interest in its own right, because we want to fit in, be accepted and loved. We want to develop, maintain and understand relationships with others, and the majority of others in our lives are polytropic. We don't really have a choice. But what would happen if, instead of explaining all of our problems with relationships simply through our own deficit in intellectual empathy, we entertain the idea that maybe polytropic people also lack intellectual empathy when it comes to monotropic people, that they have a deficit in monotropic theory of mind, so to speak, to equal or even surpass our deficit in polytropic theory of mind. This mutual understanding between neuronormative and neurodivergent people is what the social psychologist Damien Milton calls the double empathy problem, which explains the trouble we have relating to each other in terms of cultural or linguistic barriers to communication. The good news is that if that's what the problem is, the solution is simple. All we have to do is get to know each other's language and culture, and our communication, our relationships, and all of our well-being will be much the better for it. As a last thought, might I suggest that, considering that most monotropic people have already gained more than a basic diploma in polytropic thinking, the ball now seems to be fairly firmly on the polytropic side of the net? On behalf of Apidauta, I would like to wish you all, monotropists, polytropists, and all the other possible tropists there might be out there, a very happy Autism Awareness Day. If you want to find out more, Dinah's son, Fergus Murray, maintains an excellent website dedicated to the subject over at monotropism.org, where you will also find a link to an online questionnaire in which you can probe your own level of monotropism. I really do hope you've enjoyed this little exploration of the world of monotropism, and that it might go some small way towards dismantling the problem of double empathy.